Hello, it's episode 68 of the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, will a United States of Europe work? Or is it a pipe dream that we're better off out of? Well, Steve and I have already had a debate on Brexit. I think we're better off in, and, at least we can then call the shots. But Steve thinks it's built on so many falsehoods, it's bound to collapse, so we're best being the first one off the sinking ship. But with Britain out of the picture, it seems Jean-Claude Juncker is looking for a more unified Europe, perhaps with an EU army, for goodness sake, and more countries in the Eurozone using the euro as their currency, moving further into the United States of Europe, the vision that Winston Churchill had directly after the Second World War. Well, will that work? This is possibly a rhetorical question, but today let's look at how Europe differs from the United States of America and Australia, where we have federated states whose economies are managed or at least influenced by a single central bank. One of our listeners, Rob Dines, has asked us about this, so we thought we'd follow it up. So, Steve, in theory, is there any difference between the Fed in the United States governing monetary policy across the US and the ECB managing the policy across different countries of Europe?
Well, there is a huge difference, and that's because the federal government in America pays all the Social Security and collects most of the taxes, and then distributes that. The taxes are taken from a range of levels, but the spending they provide the money that is spent by the states to a large degree. Whereas in the European Union, it's still the states themselves, so-called countries, little places like France, who have to raise their own tax revenue, but can't actually finance their own government spending if it exceeds the 3% rule on the Maastricht Treaty. So it's very different. But at the same time, what we see happening in states, in countries like Australia and America, is comparable to what we see happening to countries in Europe, and that is frequently they will, quite literally, run out of money.
Yeah, because they're not getting enough divvied out from the federal pot. But also, what you say about the tax in the United States is true. There is a federal income tax, but there are state taxes as well. So, for example, in California, they add another 13% onto your federal tax, and it's often argued, isn't it? Well, this is good for competition. If you run out of money, just introduce your own local taxes, and if people don't like it, then they'll move.
Yeah, well, it's just total chaos, unfortunately, because the states can be played off against each other in the opposite direction, and we'll move to the state that has the lowest tax, and you have this race to the bottom factor as well. It really is a case that the Americans just don't want to admit they lived in a mixed economy. So you have the federal government forever talking about abolishing taxes, and the state governments, which necessarily have to put those firemen on the beat, and certainly America put those police out there so that they can shoot random drivers going past. Pardon me. I better kneel while I say that, hadn't I? And they therefore put surreptitious taxes in various places. So what starts off looking like a very low tax country ends up being, in some ways, comparable to the tax levels you'll see in parts of Europe which actually have a social democratic commitment, but in a total mess as to how those taxes are actually administered.
So for a central bank to work, for the policies of a central bank to work, then all the conditions have to be the same across the region that central bank is governing in terms of tax and other economic policy. Is that what we're saying?
Largely. It goes beyond that, because also you have differential rates of inflation between states is a major issue in Europe. And the more I look at it, the more I think that the reason that Germany is running the huge trade surplus as it is, and is therefore doing very nicely out of the euro, and has, as well as an ideological commitment, has a financial commitment to remaining in it. What they've really done is use their low inflation rate as a weapon.
Yeah.
So because they can get, batten, they really have literally, bashed verbally rather than physically, I believe, trade unions in Germany to make sure they put in wage rate demands which are below the rate of labour productivity as much as they can manage it. That therefore means you have a low rate of inflation, and that low rate of inflation with the fixed exchange rate locked into the countries in the rest of Europe means a huge trade surplus over time as your goods get progressively cheaper and cheaper compared to your competitors. So that type of dynamic is another factor which you don't necessarily have in California versus Alabama, because you have transnational companies setting the prices and operating effectively trans-state back in America itself. Their price inflation Obviously, it'll be affected by the level of income that they can mop up in different states, but it won't have the same policy differences that apply in Europe.
So in that case, is Jean-Claude's vision, which is actually really Winston Churchill's vision, that we should have a United States of Europe and go one stage further, where everyone who's in it is in the Eurozone. Perhaps they all pay the same amount of tax. It all goes into a centralised government. I mean, is that necessarily a bad thing? Certainly, we're in the half-pregnant cow situation at the moment, aren't we?
Yeah, definitely half-pregnant. It would have been feasible in 1945. This is one of those things where the classic Irish joke, which is a sign of the intelligence of the Irish rather than stupidity. It's often put across. You are
going to tell me, how do I get here? Well, it depends where you're starting from.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I wouldn't start from here. If you'd started from 1945 with the incredible desire to come together and stop the slaughter of each other and the hatreds and so on that were so laid so bare by the Nazis, in that situation, yes, you could have had a United States of Europe being formed. But after 50 or 60 years, I think the main force that is leading to Europeans re-electing Nazi parties is the idea of this obsession that Juncker and friends have of creating a United States of Europe without having created some of the essential preconditions for it, including, of course, a national treasury.
So this idea of competition between the states, I've heard that used many, many times. That in the United States, you can set your own tax on top of the federal tax if you feel like you need to, because it's going to engender competition. You're not going to raise it too much because that's going to stop people moving to your state, or people will start moving out. I've heard people arguing, maybe the same thing should be introduced in Australia. I think, like you, it's a crazy idea, but you do hear that argument. But so, I mean, could you sort of engender that sort of thing? I mean, to what extent, for example, is a centralized interest rate part of the problem? What if Europe had a single currency, but each country had its own central bank? Could you do that? So they set interest rates and set all the other economic considerations just for that country.
You're going to be rewarded the bright idea of the morning one for that. I hadn't actually thought of that as an alternative.
Well, there we are. Wonders never cease. Even bright ideas can come out of my mind. But there are some downsides to that thinking, and you can find out more about it in the full-length version of this interview. That was just the first 6 or 7 minutes. To subscribe, visit debunkingeconomics.com and choose a plan from the right-hand side of the website, or support Steve on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. Provide support of $10 or more per month, and you'll get access to the full version of this interview. It goes for about half an hour, and all the other podcasts in this series. There's 60 or so of them so far, and we keep on adding in them, including the next one, DGSE models explained and destroyed. Subscribe now so you're ready for that one too. I'm Phil Dobbie. We'll see you back here soon. Thanks for listening.